Webinar this morning in this We Got This WA webinar series. We are dedicated to providing experts and connecting them with the businesses that are part of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce or those in the greater Seattle region. I first wanted to start off by giving a special thanks to our sponsor, Symmetra. Thank you so much for making it able for us to be able to put these on at no cost for businesses across the region. And special thanks to the Seattle Metro Chamber and Business Health Trust, as they are serving their over 2,800 members, most of which are small or medium-sized businesses that we're really targeting to help in this time by connecting experts. I'm really excited about today's conversation, and I wanted to just invite our panelists to turn on their video at this time. We're going to be hearing from some folks at APCO Worldwide, and we're going to talk about planning for what's ahead. So Tim, why don't you introduce your team for us?
Yeah, thanks, Ari. We're delighted to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm Tim Smith. I'm the Managing Director of APCO Worldwide's office in Seattle. And I'm delighted to be joined by two of my colleagues from Washington, from the East Coast, Kelly Stepno from Washington, D.C., who is our North America Global Practice Lead for Crisis. And then Barry Carmichael, who is a member of our International Advisory Council and also a Batten Fellow at the Darden Business School at the University of Virginia, and former VP and Chief Communications Officer for Dow Corning.
Well, that's great. I'm very excited to have all three of you with us today as we talk about managing through the crisis and how to plan for the future. Before we get started, I wanted to just let folks know that if you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button. If you have difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat function and we will do our best to assist you. Tim, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Sari. Very briefly, for those who are not familiar with APCO Worldwide, we are a global communications consultancy and advisory firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., but with offices in more than 30 locations around the world. And so we've been in Seattle for more than 20 years, but of course, the clients we work with and the research we do and the experience that we have is really global in nature. And we're in an unprecedented time right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we thought it would be helpful to share our perspective on what we're hearing from some of our clients, the types of information that we're seeing as Seattle begins to look at reemerging to whatever we call the coming period, the new normal. I understand we're not really doing a specific like checklist of what you need to be planning as you return to a work setting. I understand that there's going to be another webinar on Thursday that will be more directly relevant to that. Rather, we wanted to take a broader view and sort of assess the overall situation in the world, because there are some profound shifts that are taking place, not just in our everyday lives and the type of work environment, the type of work we're coming back to, but that are really going to shape our businesses, our strategies for not only months, but years and decades to come. In fact, Bill Gates recently in an interview said that COVID-19 would be the defining moment of our lifetimes. And I think, if you hear a lot of the talk of the analysts and others, I mean, they compare it to a combination of 9/11 and, earlier 2008 economic downturn. So truly, this is something remarkable. And I know we're all feeling it. We're all, zooming in remotely. And so we've all had our normalized disruptive. Next slide. I mean, but really our thesis here is that a lot of the last few weeks, couple of months has been focused on the reactive, getting your applications in for your PPPs, making sure your remote workforce has the technology to connect, to keep things going, taking care of your people. We're going to look a little bit more beyond because, we now need to begin to think about what the new normal will be. And we love this quote by Abraham Lincoln, which is really, that if you're going to emerge from something, if you're going to really take control of your destiny, you've got to act. You've got to create it yourselves. Here in Seattle, I think everyone's familiar with sort of the dire situation. This is just really to set the context that this is almost unprecedented. This is City of Seattle budget office information, and the rapid recovery scenario, slow recovery scenario, we don't yet know which it will be, but either is significant in terms of impact, whether it's 65,000 jobs lost or 170,000 jobs lost. And under either scenario, a duration will be more than months. It will be the next couple of years. And that has all sorts of implications for the business community, for government, for all of us who live and work and call Seattle home. In terms of a bit broader picture, just to set the context, I mean, there should be no surprise that Americans are really concerned not only about what they're experiencing now, but even about the immediate or near-term future, 3 months out. I mean, people are already thinking about, well, what happens after some of these social distancing restrictions start to be elevated? People are very concerned about their livelihoods and their jobs. And of course, for those of us who have children, the disruption in the educational system has brought all sorts of profound changes, both in terms of everyone being at home, whether there's distance learning or not distance learning. And all of this, of course, impacts the way our workforce, our employees, our customers are thinking about things and will continue to think about things through the lens that they're experiencing now for months to come. In terms of, anxiety also, I mean, very, very emotional period of time. There's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anxiety, there's, loneliness. None of this is a surprise, but we share this because it will have an impact on sort of mental health. It will have an impact on consumer behaviors. It will have an impact on workforce, not just today, not just as we get out of social distancing, but for many, many months yet to come. And again, that is something that our clients are thinking about and will factor into their strategies for them to emerge successfully in the longer term. We also see, very importantly, sort of an increased expectation for companies and businesses doing the right thing. So leadership is critically important. CEOs are expected to, lead by example, take pay cuts if needed to try and avoid layoffs, donate actively to local charities. Also the flexibility for the workforce, accommodating people, putting employees first. All of these things, have sort of been undercurrents before, but they really came through to the fore now. And I think we should expect that a lot of these things are frankly going to permanently change the way that our offices, our businesses have been run. So even when we go back to a work environment of some sort in a staggered way, or on shifts, there may be an additional incentive for, work and home flexibility, different types of benefits, and the way we treat employees. There is maybe some good news. Didn't want to be all downer. The saxophone music at the opening was a little bit perhaps less optimistic, but some of us at home are finding more time with our family and friends. We're getting some enjoyment out of cooking, playing games, getting more sleep. I think an interesting thing here also for Seattle is that technology really has been core to all of this. It's been core to us connecting from remote workplaces. It's been key for our kids if they're distance learning. And so there has been a shift in perception of the technology industry, which of course here in Seattle is very significant, and I think will continue to play an important role in years to come. So no surprise, whether it's Zoom or whether it's streaming, Americans are now more connected to technology than they have before. And I think that, as I said, they will continue to find this positive aspect, which maybe in the past was a little bit more hidden behind some of the concerns of big technology or social media.
Yeah, Tim, I love that you mentioned the silver lining to, in this time. That's one thing I'm trying to do is look for some of the positives in everyday life, right? And, just as context, I can't imagine going through something similar 5-10 years ago, where the technology infrastructure really just was not as available. And we're really seeing just how important that technology is for all sizes of businesses and all, ages, as, even preschoolers are connecting over Zoom with their classes, as are the CEOs, making deals internationally. So, so thankful that technology is our friend right now.
Yeah, I think we've been reminded of that in a major way, and I think here in Seattle, certainly that's got to have some positive benefits long term, given our reliance on the tech sector for so much of our jobs and our economic growth. And then just the last little bit of research, which again also relates to the technology industry, is that people are using it, but they also see how pervasive technology is, and they really want technology companies to be part of the solution, whether it's directly coming up with approaches to mitigate COVID-19, whether it's for relief organizations, building PPE equipment, those sorts of things. So the technology industry, I think, has a little bit of a reputation, a blush right now, but there are also expectations which will be important to recognize and accommodate as we move forward.
All right, thanks, Tim. Let's talk a little bit about coming back stronger. So it sounds a little bit maybe even premature or impossible to think about it right now, when the implications of what's happening around us is still unfolding on an almost daily basis. But that being said, we all must do that. So I've been in crisis for 20 plus years, have managed all sorts of issues, and I can honestly say it's the first time that I'm running a crisis practice when, frankly, everybody's in crisis. And so thinking about what that looks like and what that means and the implications of risk planning and crisis planning, issues management is very different than it used to be. So just a couple of quick things. These seem fairly basic, but nonetheless, a lot of the organizations that we've started to connect with aren't necessarily thinking in the same way yet, given the fact that a lot of organizations are just trying to keep the lights on or put the lights back on, help their employees understand what the complexities are in the environment that we're living in today. So the first is, if you can, assign somebody to think about it. It can be a single person. It can be somebody in-house. It can be somebody out of house. Ideally, it would be a cross-functional team, but again, at least if you can have someone who's trying to think about what this looks like moving forward, you'd be better positioned to do so. The second point is conditioning the environment, or what we're calling kind of having a bias for action. There are things that need to happen right now in order to make sure that organizations find themselves in better positions when we come out of this, whatever come out of this actually means. Everything from thinking about the stimulus packages that exist and things that are going to happen at a local level, and making sure that you're plugged in as an organization as appropriate into those places, as well as just thinking and collecting information and making sure you understand how the world that you're living in and your stakeholder set and the business that you have is evolving, because all businesses and organizations right now are faced with this and are having an evolution. Some some in the long run will be a good evolution, and for others, obviously not so much, but needing to just think about what that looks like. And then really planning for the future. And that's sort of twofold, right? That's the idea of having some practical application. Tim mentioned that there's another webinar later this week where you'll be talking about and hearing about checklists. Barry's going to talk a little bit about some of the practical things that need to be contemplated as we all go and think about when we're going to reemerge and start going back to work and those types of things. But also thinking about kind of this higher level and asking the questions and really paying attention to the fundamental shifts that have happened and what the potential implications are for business planning, for risk mitigation, and those types of things. So one of the things that naturally we've been doing for some time, Tim just mentioned some of the data points, is also looking at what's happening in the digital and social arena, given that that's such a prominent place where all of us are playing and are spending a significant amount of time. So we've done a pretty significant analysis just to see what's happening. And naturally, there's a lot of content that is being shared. I think we're all inundated and overwhelmed, even more so than we may have been before. But we're seeing a significant decrease in brands and organizations advertising. So organizations are looking for other ways to engage across the board. What people want from brands and from organizations more broadly, frankly, is not surprising for there to be a show of empathy, for organizations to be very specific about what they're doing in managing the crisis. That's true of what organizations are doing externally, but also internally with their employees. The more specific an organization can be, the better. And then naturally making sure that messaging that is shared, this is a rule that should have been, in place beforehand, but sort of has this heightened expectation now, is on the authenticity and things that are informative and helpful for people who are getting information from brands and from organizations. So I'm going to talk just for a second about scenario planning, because as I mentioned, I've been doing scenario planning for a very long time by the nature of the fact that I am in crisis and have been working in crisis for many, many years. I think we all know scenario planning used to look something like, hey, these could be the 5 major things that we have to deal with, and this is a high risk and this is a low risk, and let's have some pretty graphics and let's figure out what that looks like and build some plans. Those days are gone. I mean, to be perfectly honest, the way we do scenario planning has changed, in my personal opinion, forever. There are a lot of things that we need to think about when we're thinking about scenario planning nowadays, some of it true before, but certainly heightened in this environment. The first is business continuity. Naturally, that's a big question mark for a lot of organizations right now. And it's not just business continuity through the lens of, oh, I had to shut down a plant for a few days because of a storm that blew through, but rather these fundamental shifts we're seeing in businesses right now, given where we are and are likely to be for the foreseeable future. Thinking about communications activities and how you engage with stakeholders and how things are changing even more rapidly, hard to believe than they were before, in terms of the ways that stakeholders have expectations around communications. Contingency planning feels very different now than it did before, and Barry's going to talk about a few things that organizations need to think about when you're opening back up your doors, because the contingency planning that we need to have in the very near term is pretty significant. And then thinking about decision making. I think that you could argue that a lot of organizations knew previously, for example, what your escalation criteria were for notifying leadership and others. I would argue that those have probably fundamentally shifted, as have tolerance for risk and other things such as stakeholder expectations, as I mentioned previously. So just quickly, the old rules for scenario planning just don't apply. Can't boil the ocean, though. A lot of organizations we're working with, we're trying to talk through the idea that it cannot be about solving this grand issue. It has to be about taking on the most immediate issues, especially first and foremost, what are we doing with our employees and our customers now? What does it look like when we reemerge? What does it look like down the line? Move quickly and often. For me, and probably for many of you, scenario planning is becoming, if weekly, if not weekly, certainly a daily event. Sitting down and thinking, this is what I need to deal with today, and how do I make sure that the decisions I'm making make sense? And then embracing new stakeholders in the efforts. If I go back to that, here's the 5 or 6 issues, and how do you do a comms plan that's supportive of that? That would be a handful of the same people. You have your comms team and a couple people in leadership. Nowadays, there's so much that's permeating in the environment in terms of how people are being impacted that you've got to think about, do I have the right people around the virtual table, so to speak, to be thinking about scenario planning moving forward. So Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Let me build on what Kelly was saying and now apply it specifically as an example of scenario planning in COVID. And what you've got is the vertical and the horizontal axis here, and I'll just walk through this. But this is one thing about scenario planning is it makes you get outside of your biases and assumptions and have to entertain perhaps different assumptions. So on the vertical side, from high, there's an effective public health response and operation, and at the low, it's an ineffective public health response. The vertical talks about economic policies, the left side being regressive policies, the right side being progressive. And I don't know if our pictures of ourselves are covering that up, but let me just take you through what that means for your planning. If you are in quadrant number 1, you're in a fun place where you have both effective public health to work with as well as progressive policies. Some people have called this the Denmark style scenario for your planning on what you're going to do and how you're going to decide. Employees are getting their wages. There is an effective coronavirus response that is either there or coming. That's one scenario. Scenario number 2 might be an effective public health response, but unequal access to that response, so that large populations cannot access the health that's required or the economic need that's required. How would that change your planning? Quadrant number 3 is where you really don't want to be. There is both an ineffective public health response and very little socioeconomic situation. In that case, you have risks of social fragmentation. None of us want to be there, but that could be a context for your doing the planning. Or number 4 is you have now got some effective socioeconomic, but the coronavirus is just not controlled. We're not testing. We aren't going any further. And in scenario planning for coronavirus, you don't control the coronavirus. You also don't control a lot of the policies, and you need to make some assumptions about what is the environment that you're going to be making decisions in. So that's just one example of how you might use a scenario planning specific to coronavirus. So let's take it to the next step. What I'm going to talk about is, before we get into specifics of what are some things you ought to think about, based on that scenario planning, it's really important to understand the considerations you need to do when you're making decisions. So that's the first part of this, is planning considerations. The first, realize that government officials are not going to decide the pace of a ramp up in business. Your customers are. They'll decide, for example, if they go on a cruise ship or take an airport flight, shop at a store, or buy your products. So what that means for you is, what in your planning are you doing to give confidence to your customers, or customers through your supply chain, that they can trust you, that they can trust you to have reliable supply, that they can trust you to make them safe to come into the store. Clearly, employees are critical in all of this, and there will be a time when they are both on-site and online. I would assume in your scenario planning, you ought to think about a hybrid situation existing for a matter of months, with some people here, some people not. What that means is that you need to have ongoing engagement with employees to build their confidence, access to what the situation is. Some companies are putting up spreadsheets that their employees can access to know the current status of all the government regulations in every location, for example, so that they have constant access to information. The next is, do not assume a straight path forward. I think part of our planning bias is to say, well, this is just a matter of whether the COVID recovery will be fast or slow. Well, COVID recovery could have U-turns. It could do a recycle. And it's very important to consider resiliency planning for and expect the unexpected, that involve multiple locations having different contexts for all of that. And finally, a planning consideration is to realize the connectedness in all of this, that you need to not plan in silos. I highly recommend having highly multifunctional planning teams in place. So for example, on employees, some employees may want to come back, but let's look at the numbers. 1/3 of US households, based on census statistics, say 1/3 of those households have children under the age of 14. Within those households, 1 in 10 will have an adult that is there to take care of the child at home, when there's no school and there's no daycare. So how are you going to know whether employee A who says, I want to come back into work can come into work tomorrow? Or for example, your connectedness to your partners and suppliers. If your employees do come into work, who's going to serve them lunch? How will they get access to food? How are they going to get there? What about the elevators? So there, as you make plans for reentry, realize you need to plan with partners. That's the main point about don't plan in silos. The other two things I would say is that very often, and I've also dealt with crises, it's tend to focus on mitigating risk as number one. But you should plan on both mitigating risk and advancing your purpose. You can do a both and, it's not an either or. So let's look at the next slide. The first thing I want to emphasize is what business controls in this reentry is not a lot in terms of the environment that you're in. The studies of the places that have managed coronavirus fairly well so far have these five things in common happening simultaneously. It's not just social distancing. We hear a lot about that, but it also must be widely accessible testing, and we're not there yet. It also needs to be contact tracing so that you can figure out who ought to be put in isolation, which then leads to accessible healthcare and treatment. And until you have all five, you are not looking at coronavirus in the rearview mirror. And what that means is business cannot control all five. So in this interim period, you are in a risk mitigation scenario with a less than perfect context. So given that, let's look at the next slide about mitigating risk and advancing purpose. Many companies under the banner of mitigating risk are saying that as a condition to even open, they need to be able to have testing, COVID testing on site. There are something like 25% of the Fortune 200 companies surveyed that said that they would not open until there was on-site testing. Testing is a moving target right now. LabCorp has just announced a do-at-home testing kit that's capability. It's a moving target every day. But some companies are even delaying reopening until they can actually do testing on site so that they know every day, because testing is not a one-off thing. Just because you pass day one doesn't mean you'll pass day two. Other companies are looking at how do they implement contact tracing through mobile devices. Apple and Google, for example, are developing an app. I've also heard about wristbands that can tell you when you get within 6 feet of people. There are a lot of new technologies that are coming that are going to allow and improve contact tracking, but that means that you need to be on top of that for planning it. Another aspect of going back in mitigating risk is how are you going to structure the work? What I'm not talking about here is how you structure the workplace. I'm talking about how you structure the work itself. Are you going to have staggered shifts? Microsoft China, at least as I read, and if you're anybody from Microsoft is on, I read a few days ago that half of the workforce in Microsoft China are coming in and half of them aren't. Other companies have talked about having work pods of no bigger than 5 people so that they can control the amount of exposure. Other aspects are redesigned workspace for separation. Some companies, for example, in addition to having ongoing cleaning operations, are saying every desk, every day, or maybe more than a day, will be covered with paper placemats, things that will reduce exposure. There are elevator paths and workflows and all sorts of different work design efforts going on to limit exposure. If you're in retail operations, there's a lot of work going on limiting the physical density of retail operations. If any of you have shopped at Costco and been in line, you know what I mean. But there are lots of different ways. Food Lion, for example, and other companies are having certain shopping hours for people of more higher risk demographics to shop during then. And then finally, other risk management, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just an example of lists that you ought to have for policies and procedures. What are your policies for on-site health issues? There will be surprises. If somebody gets sick during the day, who do they report to? What's the policy? How do you handle that? This contingency planning has got to be clear, and roles and responsibilities per site have to be understood. Those are all the kinds of things that you'll put down as you're looking at mitigating risk. There's also advancing purpose. the first part I have is kind of the downside of that, and I call it managing the gap. You've already seen what I call the bullshit meter operating quite well. That is, there was an article in the New York Times, I think Monday of last week, that went through all the signatories of the Business Roundtable Statement on Corporate Purpose and called them out where their actions on coronavirus weren't meeting up to the high-minded statements on purpose. There is going to be a lot of second guessing going on. So you would be best served if you second guess yourself about the policy and the actions that you're implementing and how well do they align with your purpose before somebody calls you on it. Now, if you do get called on it, you need to change, not unlike Shake Shack and other people who have been called on things. So manage the gap, and that's an ongoing vigilance. The next part about advancing purpose is what you're seeing with coronavirus, where companies are leveraging their core competencies to meet COVID needs. A lot of that is going on in Seattle, for example, with the creation of face masks with Nike and a few other companies that are nearby working on making face masks. Apple. Ford has also transformed their plants into making face masks. GM has been producing the breathing tubes. I've forgotten what the machine is called that they're needing in hospitals. My point is that companies are taking a core capability and saying, how can we apply that to COVID? It might be making hand sanitizer. And then finally, another example of advancing purpose is that you don't need to do it alone, nor do you need to do it with just friends. For example, I think Kelly can add to this too. There's been a lot of examples of post-competitive or rivalry partnerships. I'll give you one. For the COVID virus, one key potential remedy is a therapy for antibody plasma. And a lot of people are donating antibody plasma that has worked in Ebola. Two major global suppliers of plasma therapies are Takeda Pharmaceuticals and CSL Behring. They've entered into an agreement to offer a non-branded therapy for plasma that they will join together in the supply chain to get that produced to reduce the speed to market and effectiveness of that product. There are other examples of multiplier partnerships like that going on. Unlikely partners coming to the fore to solve the problem. Kelly, I think you've got some other examples on the partnerships too.
Yeah, I mean, there's, to your point, Barry, there's a number of different examples out there. You have Google and Apple, you have, Janssen and J&J working closely with some competitors, a lot of folks in the biopharma space doing that. So yeah, there's a number of different examples out there with people having to think and organizations having to think a little bit differently about how to solve these societal issues. And if you can do that with someone who previously was a competitor or is still a competitor, all the better. I mean, frankly, that's the expectation that people have right now. Solve the problem. I don't care how you solve it, but please solve it.
Agreed. I'm ready for the next one. Go ahead. I think Kelly.
Yep, I'm picking up. So thanks, Barry. All great perspective there, in particular thinking about, again, what do we need to do from a practical standpoint in terms of opening back up in a way that makes sense and is matters and is important to the people that work for organizations, as well as the organizations, customers, et cetera. As we look to the future, one of the things that we've been talking about and trying to think about beyond just the practicality of where we are at this moment in time are trying to get at some of those things that are happening that we know are a fundamental shift in the way that we're all operating, that are likely not to dissipate when we come out of the COVID-19 crisis. So at APCO, what we've pulled together are a handful of questions we think as organizations are rethinking strategy about their businesses and are planning differently and are thinking differently about risk, which, by the way, what I've been talking with organizations about is this is not a strategy 2.0 or a risk planning mitigation 2.0 or a business planning 2.0. This is a complete and fundamental shift for most organizations in terms of business planning, strategy, and risk mitigation. And I think that's the sooner that organizations can accept that to the best of their ability to do so, the better. Because I do think that some of the organizations that we connect with are still grappling with that a little bit, and it's hard. And to Barry's point, it all needs to be done through the lens of an organization's purpose. What is your vision? What is your mission? You should naturally stay consistent to that, but you need to think about what are the fundamental shifts in the environment that are really changing my business. As mentioned earlier, in some cases, maybe that's changing your business for the better. In many cases, that's changing your business in a way that you didn't anticipate or frankly want, but you're going to have to adjust to. So the first question that we talk about when we think about organizations that we're working with is, what does it mean to be essential? If you had asked before COVID-19 what it meant to be essential, I think we'd all have very different definitions of what that looked like. There are a lot of organizations now who are in the fray beyond just healthcare workers and hospitals, everything from grocery stores to scientists to online retailers, et cetera. And really kind of understanding in our current environment what it means to be essential is important, because where people think about organizations as being essential, naturally, for the most part, if you're doing that well and right, you have a reputational uptick. However, if you're doing that wrong, you have a pretty significant impact on your reputation. And one of the things that we've seen, and I think we've all seen it, but is this, I guess, a little bit of kind of disagreement, for lack of a better way of calling it, between people in organizations who work for organizations that may not have been considered essential in the past, but are now, and this idea of not having kind of opted in for that. And what do you do with your employees when they did not opt in to be in something that is essential, but is now considered so? What does that look like for planning? What does that look like for the near term and the long term? And as organizations think about rebuilding strategies, that's a really important point, because I think that this is going to continue to be the case, and we need to think about it as we move down the line. Stakeholders. Stakeholders are evolving literally by the minute, both in their expectations of organizations, what they need from organizations, how they get their information from organizations, but also fundamentally, many stakeholder sets are changing for organizations themselves. So I work with organizations that have been in the travel industry, for example, in the meetings industry for many, many years. Meeting in person right now is obviously not happening. There is a fundamental shift with these organizations in who they need to think about engaging with, and engaging with differently. They're naturally having to engage virtually, which was not what was happening before. They're having to think differently about what it means moving forward to have meetings in the near term and the long term. So really thinking about what are those changes and paying attention to them early enough to be able to pivot and engage differently. What the last thing you need is for these stakeholder groups to be changing, for you not to be paying attention to that, and then what you're sharing and the way you're engaging, not really then connecting with your stakeholder groups moving forward. Systematic fractures, look, we don't need to beat this point to death. The reality is we know that there have been a number of systematic fractures that have come to light through the advent of this pandemic. We know that it's fundamentally disrupted our lives and will continue to do so, to the point that Tim raised with the research earlier. This is here for a while. So the way that we have to manage through this is with this idea that we don't know what the end looks like. We don't even know what the middle looks like. But we've got to do the best we can to operate in a way that we are agile and can make pivots and can shift in a way that matters and makes sense. You need to think about different ways of solving problems. We'll mention it again in a minute, but Barry was talking about different partnerships. What does that look like and how does that help us? And then thinking about how do you engage with your stakeholders and how do you find, again, solutions to the problems that society is looking for, and those organizations that can find systematic hacks. Those solutions to those fundamental issues we're talking about are naturally going to be in a better position in the long term if they're able to do that. How can rivals be partners? Barry mentioned a few examples. I mentioned a few examples. The important point here is we've got to think differently about this, because again, the expectation from people is that you will solve the problem. They do not care how you do so. And in fact, the expectation is that you will do so, even if it means joining hands and engaging with others you may not have done so in the past. And then finally, I think a lot of people would agree that we are in an era of doubling down on stewardship and really leading with empathy. those organizations that are not listening and learning based upon the information that their stakeholders are putting forward are going to be at a disadvantage because what you put out there may be tone deaf. It may not feel like it's authentic. It may not engage with your stakeholders in the way that you want. So just thinking about and taking it from a perspective that while this may not be the way your organization operated previously, it's not to say that you didn't have a mission or a vision or purpose, but there are ways that organizations are going to need to act very differently moving forward than they did before. And it does come with empathy. To Barry's point, with your employees, if you have employees who are going to have to continue to homeschool their children through the fall, that's a very different equation than we were at just 6 months ago. And it really is going to fundamentally shift the way we operate inside organizations and outside of organizations. Tim, I'll hit it back to you for just this last slide.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly and Barry. And just coming back to Seattle, look, Seattle's been through difficult times before. And I don't know if any of you were here back in 1971 when this legendary billboard went up. I mean, this is not really a turn out the lights moment. It has some of the implications of it, but really there's nowhere to go, right? Because this was such a widespread, broad impact economically, health-wise. So there are some similarities, but a lot of differences. And actually, if you go back and you look, I mean, part of that was the decline in employment at Boeing, but then it sort of rebounded fairly quickly in the early 70s. And of course, we got out of that moment in time. We were fortunate that we have a very strong economy. I mean, we went into this actually in pretty good shape. It's not that the economy was waffling. Yes, we've had problems, but you know, our core sectors were doing well. Now, major hit to small businesses, hospitality industry, tourism, other sectors are truly going to feel this. And for them, the path is a slightly different path, probably a more contorted path. You know, some likely will not survive, but as a community, we should rally around, as I know the Chamber and many other organizations are, to give support to our businesses as it can. We do have the strength of a very vibrant technology and health sector, which is really going to be a plus for Seattle. We talked a little bit about now the new maybe the evolving views towards technology, the expectations of the technology sector. There is a lot there. And if you talk about artificial intelligence, all of the different things that are going to be outgrowths of this current period of time actually positions Seattle quite well as in the health community, not only our healthcare providers, but some of our great researchers and the work that's being done by organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or PATH, or IHME at the University of Washington. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is think broadly for your organization and sort of what you're going to navigate. So there's the operational work of getting things back on track, of making sure your workforce is supported, making sure you're doing all the things that you need to do to emerge as strongly as possible. But there are going to be knock-on impacts, which also will have long-term implications. What will the impact be on a homelessness issue? Traffic. I mean, there may be some, as less people are commuting to work, certainly the streets in Seattle are much less crowded than they were before. So there may be some mitigating factors there. What does that mean for transit policies? And then, of course, the great tax debate. And, do we tax more our businesses or not, as governments spend a lot to try and get us through the most immediate needs? So, think about your company, think about your sector, your industry, how your stakeholders have shifted, but also make sure you're thinking broadly about some of the other knock-on impacts which will arrive over coming years because of this instance that we have gone through currently. And then finally, I don't know, Barry may want to add something to this.
Yeah,
but
I can add the next
yeah,
slide and hand it off to you, Tim, to moderate the questions. But Kelly, I think there's one more slide. Yeah. I think it's important to understand that just because this is an inflection point for all of us, and it means that the actions your company takes, how you treat your stakeholders, are going to define your legacy. Companies can emerge stronger, I think, if they make sure that they're proving their purpose by their actions taken, and they're taking care of those who are close to home the best. And to reemphasize what both Kelly and Tim were saying, and I lived through some existential crises when I was at Dow Corning. The thing that I discovered is the winners when you're in a situation like that, the leaders, will not be who won, who lose, but who is the leader to finding a common ground? Who can be the enabler of finding common ground solutions? And can you participate in that or lead that? That will be the key. Now, I believe that all of you can get access to these slides, but at the next step, I think, are questions. And Tim, maybe you can be the moderator.
Yeah, and Kelly, if you jump to the next slide, just in terms of, there's a web link there or a URL. We have aggregated a lot of information, keep it up to date in terms of best practices, what companies and others are doing, the research that we shared, and new research that comes out every week. So feel free to go to that link. We also have a sign up for a twice weekly media coverage report that really aggregates a lot of the essential coverage about what's happening in the world, different developments that you can also sign up for if you're interested.
And we also have just added and launched today a blog series on Coming Back Stronger, where we're going to have experts weigh in on the perspective from different industries. So you can also get that through the link here below.
Great. And just a reminder for all those participating today and watching, the slides will be shared at a later date. The APCO team, if you also could send us that link around, we'll include that in our email around to folks as well with the link to the slides and this recording. So we have a couple minutes for questions. You know, you were just talking about some of the tangible best practices and tools, those sorts of things that, you know, folks can tap into. What would be, you know, if you were to each say one thing that a business owner or operator should start thinking about, what would that be right now? What's that first step?
So I'll go first. I think employee engagement is absolutely critical. I think it's been important. It's been growing because over the last decades, I mean, how your employees get information, the competitive of the labor market, expectations, all sorts of things are shifting. And I really think we've gone through a period now where employers have really had to demonstrate, you know, how empathetic they are with their employees, sort of how willing to accommodate. And I think as we rebound on the other side, that's going to be critical. You're going to want to make sure you're supporting your employees through a time which is going to continue to be somewhat disruptive and challenging. You're going to want to make sure you have all the health protections in place. But organizations that can do that and can keep their workforce feeling like they are the #1 priority and they are supported, I think will long-term emerge with a very strong reputation and a very strong loyalty among their employees. And that will serve them well.
And I'll just
go ahead.
Go ahead, Barry.
And I would say that don't assume, I can't imagine a company that doesn't want to be empathetic to employees, but I can imagine a company that maybe doesn't understand the depth of some of the things they're dealing with. So feedback loops from employees to understand what are their barriers. You will be surprised at what you'll be surprised. And so you've got to make sure you've got channels so that your stakeholders, both your customers and your employees, can give you quick feedback on what's blocking, what's happening, because then you can remedy it.
Right. Well, and to that end, not surprisingly, the crisis person on the phone is going to say scenario planning, but it's through the lens of the two things that Tim and Barry were just referencing, right? So I couldn't agree more that employee engagement has to be first and foremost. And then to Barry's point, having these feedback loops, because what you also want to be thinking about is, again, the scenarios that you have to plan for now are very different than they were before. So having a framework for that scenario planning and being able to constantly look and make sure that as more and more of your employees, for example, come back to work, or if there is a hybrid, what are the steps that you need to take to make sure that you're mitigating any potential issues that arise, as many organizations are doing this for the very first time. There are going to be questions, there are going to be concerns, there are going to be challenges with collecting data and all of those types of things. So trying to have a framework from which to operate to make sure you can quickly get at any issues is really going to be pretty important.
So, you know, talking about that employee engagement piece, you know, many employees are furloughed. How would pardon me, an employer go about interpersonal relations as less experienced employees take on additional responsibilities? You know, how transparent should people be with leadership changes?
You know, there was a good piece recently I read that said that there's fundamentally 3 pillars to trust. One is authenticity. I mean, can I believe what you say? Do you act it? Another is competence. You might be empathetic, but if you're incompetent, it doesn't do much good. So you need all three. You need authenticity, competence, and empathy together. And for all of that, as you're dealing with employees, sometimes I guess when I've been in business, there are some leaders that are naturals at all three, and some leaders that just aren't. So I would recommend that companies pick wisely who are their go-to people for in these multifunctional teams for managing the employee concerns or the customer concerns. You need to structure a go-to place with people with responsibility so that they can answer, so employees know where to go, as opposed to going to a website and trying to self-help on the questions.
Right. So going back to a little bit of, the leading with empathy, I think that that's a really important concept, especially in our current economic and health crisis. So, the pandemic has really exposed disparities of low-income households, those without privilege have grappled with, and it's really bringing that to light as, folks are essential workers that didn't want to be essential workers. What are your perspectives on leading with empathy and thoughts around how to do that in those situations that, there are disparities there are the involuntary essential workers that are now dealing with the front lines?
I can go, and then, or Tim, were you going to go?
Well, no, I was just going to say, look, I think we're living through this now, and it's maybe a little bit too soon. It's definitely too soon to know where this will end up. But I think there is, as Kelly was talking about, there is a redefinition taking place about what is an essential worker and what do we think of an essential worker. And so even first responders, we celebrate so many of the professions in our society that do wonderful things, but I don't know that we've really thought in terms of the essential workers. And I think a lot of people who will reflect on this period we're going through will recognize that these people were on the front lines. So
Right.
I think we will see changes in how they are treated by employers, by the public, and probably we'll also see some changes in terms of government laws and regulations to maybe shorten the gap between sort of calling someone an essential worker and treating them like they're more essential.
And I also think that it's important, Kelly said, don't boil the ocean. Bring that question back to your company. Just as every company, I've said before, has an environmental footprint, every company also has a social footprint. And the coronavirus has made that social footprint live and real. I suspect many companies are realizing they had essential employees that they hadn't previously thought of as essential employees until this came. And so I would say that to look at that economic disparity that you were asking about, it's now time for an honest look for companies to look at their own social footprint in terms of their employees or their customer access to their products. There's lots of different ways, and understanding what are the social barriers that you have a responsibility to address.
Yeah, I would also just add to that to simply say that, for organizations right now, I think one of the biggest things that, in particular in places where employees have been voluntold to be essential, I think they want an acknowledgement of that. I think they want their organization to acknowledge the fact that, yes, we find ourselves in this moment in time where our organization and your work is deemed essential, and we recognize that that was not necessarily a choice that all of you made, and making sure that to the best of your ability to do so at this very moment in time, you are at least putting those needs of those employees at the forefront. What do they need? How are they going to be safe? What are we thinking about in terms of pay? What are we thinking about in terms of hours? What are we thinking about in terms of childcare? Like asking some very basic questions, because right now we need to manage through that. And then as we move forward to all the points that Tim and Barry were raising, we need to plan for that and think differently, and we will think differently. We're already thinking differently. But I think at the moment in time we're in, that's the number one thing that organizations can do.
And that's a good example, Kelly, of it's not just empathy, that is, you realize it, but then you've got competence, you do something about it.
Yeah, I really like the don't boil the ocean example. That's a great visual for me. And your comments, Kelly, about really treating people the way you want to be treated, right? I was talking with a business owner the other day about some of these issues, and they've found their whole company in the front lines now as a janitorial company. And, the business owner, without any hesitation, said, well, I'm going to do as if they were my own son, daughter, brother, sister. They need PPE, they need these things, and I'm just going to work as hard as I can to support them, which I think is just a really amazing perspective, and one that in all of our companies we should be looking at. You know, if it's an essential worker or front lines or not. And also, I love and hate the word essential worker, because every job is really very essential, right? But you know, when we're talking about those people that are serving people just in their daily life, you know, grocery stores, those sorts of things, that they didn't sign up for that, and kind of the exposure that comes with it. So switching gears a little bit, do you have any advice or words of warning, things to stay away from as you're going through this planning process?
You know, I would just throw out there, and I think it's been woven through much of what we said, is don't expect that you have the answers, don't expect the answers are easy, and don't expect that the answers you have today are going to be the same answers in a month. It's a very fluid situation. It's unprecedented. It's something that everyone is grappling with. And so I think it's, you know, related to empathy, but it's listen closely. It's participate in these sorts of conversations to hear what others are doing. You know, if you're in a work environment, talk to your employees, understand their perspective, their point of view, what's going well, what's not going well, and lead with those three attributes: the empathy, the authenticity, and the competency that Barry had mentioned, because we're all in this together. And I think you need to be a genuine sort of leader and build your reputation. I think it was Henry Ford who said, you can't build a reputation talking about what you're going to do. It's like, this is a definitional time where what you do, as hard as it is, and even if sometimes you do the wrong things, but you know, you course correct as more information comes through, will pay dividends long term for your employees, for your customers, for your partners. And so it's just doing your best, but I think keeping open and keeping that dialogue and communication as things shift.
Yeah, and I mean, I to add, I mean, one of the things that we've already said a couple of times is don't boil the ocean. I mean, I cannot stress the level to which, if you are doing that, you are fundamentally moving in the wrong direction. You are spending way too much time and energy trying to solve for big, when what you really need to solve for is the moment in time that you're in. And so being nimble and being able to think about what are the issues today, tomorrow, the next day that I really need to get through, while the people I've assigned, even if that's only one other person, are thinking further down the line. Because you could get in trouble thinking, well, I've got to think about how I open back up and what the future looks like. And then you're missing the problems that you have today, that if you were looking and paying attention to, and to Tim's point, hearing from your employees and understanding where some of the significant issues were, you'd be able to mitigate some of those issues ahead of time. So it's sort of that perspective of making sure that that's what we're doing moving forward.
I also think you have to plan your governance. I lived through corporation going through an existential crisis called silicone breast implants that lasted over a decade. And we had to establish an issue management group that was the governing body for how we would make decisions, authorize actions, things like that. I think coronavirus also requires some decision on part of the company, and that is true of a small organization or a large organization. You still need to understand who's responsible for making what decisions, and people need to know who they go to for getting answers. So how are you going to structure your governance? That's when I had the planning consideration slide up. Think about what your multifunctional teams are, who heads it, what authority do they have, and then people need to know where they need to go to get answers, because you can't be authentic, competent, and empathetic if you've got no place to go. So you've got to structure that.
Great point. Well, thank you all for participating today. This was a really helpful conversation. For those listening in, we will be having another webinar, kind of a part 2 to this conversation, that will be taking a look at a business checklist and some of those more specific things for business owners to be thinking of. I think this is the perfect context going into Thursday of some of the things for business owners and operators to start thinking about. So please check out that webinar, and you can register on the Seattle Metro Chamber events page. And also next week, we will be doing a Paycheck Protection Program loan forgiveness focus, a part 3. So as the final rules have been developed, we will be taking a look through those and answering some additional questions that have come through. So be on the lookout for that as well. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Saran.
Thank you.
Thank you.